Okay, recording in progress.
Okay, boy, that sounds formal. Okay, so thank you all for coming. We're still missing 2 speakers who are going to be late, but that's fine because I have a few things to say. This is our first chapter meeting of the 2022-2023 season, and we actually have almost our entire season planned, and we have links for them all on our website. We have one open space, which is May, and a couple of questions about some speakers, but basically we're ready to go on through this year. We will be on Zoom for most of this year. It's possible we might have one in-person meeting or try to figure out some way that we can get together in person, but that won't happen this fall. In the future, for those of you who are here, I want to try to start these meetings pretty promptly because I think we end up having a lot to say and we usually have to end up cutting off some of the questions. So I'm going to try something tonight for all of you who've been away from Zoom for the past 4 or 5 months. I'm going to do a little screen share. And just to remind you how to use some of the features of Zoom. So if you want to be visible, you're going to go down here in the corner where it says start video. And if I click on that, it will make the real David appear instead of this is David's photograph. So if you want to be visible, do that. To mute yourself, I have a different slide for that, but I can do it right here. This is mute yourself. Make sure that that is turned off when you're not talking. And then when you do ask a question, make sure to unmute yourself. If you see people waving at you, it probably means that you've forgotten to unmute yourself. The captions, this is very important to a lot of us, is down here. David has circled this and labeled it. CC, live transcript. This will give you about 4 or 5 lines at the bottom of the screen, 2 or 3 maybe. If you missed something, you can go on. There's something that will allow you to see the full transcript. So you can go back, a couple of sentences and catch up if you missed something. But this is Lauren Schechter, our captioner. These are her live captions. And these will also show up in the recording. And then the last one is how to raise your hand. So we'll have a lot of questions coming up. And you go, I have to go back a step a minute. So to raise your hand, you're going to reactions and you open that and you'll see this. You go right here, you click on that. And that'll raise your hand, and then you'll be lined up at the top of the screen in order of your questions asked, so nobody will get left behind. And then one important thing when you're finished is to click on raise your hand again so that your hand is lowered. It may even say hand is lowered. So I hope that's clear to everybody. You can ask questions in the chat, which is right here. And that will show up on the right-hand side of your screen. I can't do it because this is just a slide, but you can say in the chat, Catherine, you're talking too fast, or please ask somebody to turn their mic off, mute themselves because there's extra noises coming through, or you can comment on what's being discussed, and you can also ask questions in the chat if you prefer to do that than to raise your hand. So I think that's our Zoom refresher. I do want to say a few things before we start. Let me stop sharing here, get this off my screen. We hope to find a new in-person meeting space sometime in the next year. We lost our space shortly after we stopped meeting in person for COVID because the building where we used to meet, the church on 35th Street, has been torn down. They don't, or at least is being redesigned, and we don't have our meeting place anymore. If anyone knows of a space that's looped and that can hold up to 100 people, we do hope to get back to in-person meetings at some point. So we would love to hear about it. And you can write to our main information number, which is info@hearinglossnyc.org. The other thing I want to say is that our Walk for Hearing was last Sunday. It was in a new location. It was on Pier 45, which was an adventure for some of us getting there. It was quite beautiful to be there, and right on the river. It was a temporary location, but there was a really good turnout, and actually there was a good spirit. It was lots of fun. If you were not part of the walk, it would be great if you could donate to the walk. It is not too late to do that. You can find the walk icon right on the homepage of our website. Or if you'd like, you can donate to the chapter directly, either via the website or via check. And we have also just added on the website the ability to give by Zelle, which goes directly from your bank account to our bank account, and it's a safer way to do that. So we, many people who attend our meetings are not actually members of the chapter, and so we really can't rely on chapter dues. So that's one reason we're asking you please to keep us in mind when you're making your contributions. And while you're on the website, I just want to say, please take a look at our new advocacy page. We have added a lot of information about things that we've accomplished in the past year or so. And I'm not going to talk about them all here, but just the advocacy runs across the top of the screen. And there's some really pretty great things that have happened. I want to say one quick thing about open caption live theater, Broadway and off-Broadway. Most of you know about the TDF-TAP program, which provides captions performances during the year, usually one performance per show. The chapter our board voted to sponsor one performance, and we are sponsoring the October 20th performance of A Strange Loop. Seats are still available in the captioned area. You sit, it's generally in the lower right front orchestra with the caption screen right in front of you. That is playing at the Lyceum Theater on Broadway, and there are some tickets left. There are 2 more open caption performances coming, and we're going to try to announce these at the beginning of each chapter meeting because a lot of people just don't know that they exist, and we don't really want to send out a blast about it because we want to save those for chapter business. But there's a play called Baldwin at the Public Theater, which is open captioned on October 8th, and a new play, Cost of Living, at the Samuel J. Friedman Theater on October 22nd. So just go to the TDF website. It's free to join. The tickets are really highly discounted. They require some proof of your hearing loss in order to be eligible for the TAP program, which stands for Theater Access Program. But basically a letter from your audiologist or an audiogram would do. It's fine. And you can also take a guest who's hearing. That's not forbidden. So anyway, I want to get right onto our speakers. And I'm going to give you a short bio of them. I'm not sure. I'm going to see Viral last because I don't think he's here yet. I can't really see everybody who's here, but I'm going to start with Sophie Racine. We have a panel of 4 speakers.
Catherine Viral is here.
What? Viral's here? Okay.
Yes.
It'll be easier for me to get in order. Yeah, so we have 4 speakers, and David Landsberger is going to be our moderator. So Viral Tejani, I hope I'm doing that right, is a cochlear implant audiologist, and he's an assistant professor of audiology of otolaryngology, I'm sorry, University Hospitals, Case Western Reserve University.
Yay.
Yeah, okay, good. There's a fan there for Case Western Reserve. He sees cochlear implant patients in the clinic, and he's also involved in research, both NIH funded and industry funded research. He completed his AUD at the University of Maryland and his Ph.D. at the University of Iowa, where he was a faculty member before relocating to Cleveland. He has worn hearing aids in both ears since he was 3 years old. All of our panelists have hearing loss, which is probably clear to those of you who signed up. Dr. Racine, Sophie Racine, is making a return appearance here. She was part of our May meeting with Barbara Weinstein on the future of audiology. We had young audiologists and mostly students of Barbara's, or maybe all students of Barbara's. Sophie was then working at Montefiore Medical Center, and she was also at that point a mentor for children at the Center for Hearing and Communication, CHC, which many of you know. She is now at Seattle Children's Hospital. She is the creator of a comic strip called The Misadventures of Miss Heard, MISSHEARD. I haven't seen it, but I really look forward to seeing it. It's about an audiologist with hearing loss. Terrence Williams, I'm also not sure Terrence is here yet, but is familiar to many of you. He's a member of the board of directors of our chapter. He is the assistant director of the Hearing Technology Center at the Center for Hearing and Communication. He has more than 25 years experience as a hearing instrument specialist, and he focuses on assistive listening systems and learning technology. And he will also be a speaker at our March 2023 meeting, which will be on home safety, how you can make your home safer for somebody with hearing loss. On Thursdays at 2, you can see him right now. He leads a free online program where you can learn about some of the devices, caption phones, wireless TV headsets, and so on, vibrating alarm clocks. And Terrence was diagnosed with a hearing loss in his early 20s. He happened to be at a hearing aid convention he was attending that week for work. Last is Dr. Paul Hammerschlag, familiar to many of you, I think. He is now retired as an otologist, neurotologist. In 2017, he retired following a long career as a physician surgeon specializing in the diagnosis and treatments of problems related to the ear, the temporal bone, and the facial nerve. He was director of the neurotology, otology surgery at the NYU School of Medicine, and he was a faculty member at Bellevue Hospital Center and co-director of the NYU Center for Ear Development Anomalies. Could have read all that on our website. I probably didn't need to repeat all of it. He has a lifetime connection to the Center for Hearing and Communication. When he was a child, that organization was then known as the League for Hard of Hearing. And when he was very young, his parents brought him to the League for Hard of Hearing for hearing services. He already had hearing loss as a young child. And he currently serves on the board of directors of CHC, and he has also served on the board of directors of HLAA. And our moderator is David Landsberger. Most of you also know him. He will also be presenting later in the season. He has a wonderful presentation on the history of cochlear implants, which some of us have seen, and it's well worth sharing. He is an auditory scientist at NYU Langone, and his research focuses on how the auditory system responds to electrical stimulation produced by cochlear implant. So David, this is over to you. I'm going to mute my phone, even though my dog decides that I'm not going to bark anymore right now. So thank you very much, David. Thank you, panelists. I think this is going to be great.
Great. Wonderful. I am thrilled by this panel. Shouldn't take too much time. Should we get started? Does anyone want to volunteer to start, or shall I assign somebody to begin? Okay. Viral Tejani, I'm going to call on you because you're first on my screen.
Go for it.
Great. It's wonderful to see you here. You're gonna tell us a little something about your experiences as a professional with hearing impairments?
So, I got into the field primarily motivated by the fact that I have hearing loss myself, and I wanted to be able to help patients like I was helped myself, and in many ways it's been a very rewarding experience because patients do know that I relate to them in a different level than that many other audiologists can't relate to. So that's that is so it's a huge driving motivation as to why I do what I do, both in the clinic as well as a researcher. Um, but then I think me having hearing loss gives me a different perspective on the research side as well, because I think I think about issues differently than a lot of my normal hearing peers who are in the auditory science fields. And sometimes I'll ask them questions about, how have you thought about this? Because it has a real world impact on how patients hear. So I think it's hearing some of the new research that is coming out. For example, there's a lot of research on listening effort, which hasn't really been explored until recently. And just because many of us do okay with hearing aids doesn't mean that we put a lot of effort into it. So I think I think it's allowed me to also ask and question things from a different perspective. Um, one of the downsides I unfortunately experienced training as an audiologist with hearing loss was doubts from other audiologists as to whether or not I could do my job. And it always feels like an uphill battle to prove that you can do you can do this job despite the fact that you have hearing difficulties. So I feel like I fought that battle quite a bit during my training, but even now, occasionally I feel like I have to prove myself that I have to prove myself to others that I can still do my job.
So how do your peers, by which I mean clinical peers, how do they respond to you in your hearing loss, in the sense of, is this, do they respect it? Do they what is their reaction to you in their interactions on this topic?
Many of my peers are quite positive about it. I think it's because they know I'm open to talking about it. So because I'm open to talking about it, they feel more open to asking me about it. They might ask questions about, oh, do you know what caused your hearing loss? Or, what devices do you wear? How long have you worn them? So, most of these are like normal curiosity questions that, as long as, uh, I think, I think as long as I present things in a, nice, positive fashion, I think they've been pretty receptive to it. And they've also been receptive to some of the criticisms I have about technology in general, because, I've experienced it all my life. So it's been pretty positive in general. It's just a few occasional, I think higher level people that don't believe that I can do my job. That's the only thing. But that's been few and far between nowadays.
Have you run into any situations where you are unable to do the job, or it's become a challenge for you personally?
I think I know, like when I was training, I did run into a few like situations where I thought to myself, I know my limits, like I should not do XYZ thing. Um, and I think that's just it's part of the game. Like in the end, yes, I do have some limitations, and I have to be smart enough to acknowledge that, and then either find a good workaround, or if there's not a good workaround, then understand and accept the fact that I shouldn't do XYZ portion of audiology. Um, yeah, so that's really all I have to say about that.
Dr. Racine. What's your story? How did you end up an audiologist?
Yeah, so similar where I grew up with a hearing loss from a young age, but I, didn't really know anybody else like myself. So I felt very much in this gray space of hearing world, non-hearing world. And for a while, I didn't realize that I was yearning for that connection of meeting someone else like myself until I graduated college and was working. And I was working in a completely different field. I did a career change. I was in finance and Wall Street. I thought maybe this might be the thing for me. And then I realized I don't love the idea of helping people make more money. I like the idea of helping people with the hearing health. And so that's when I decided to change into audiology. From there, I kind of been narrowing down of what works best for me, which is, what demographic of people do I work well with? And I love working with adults. I think I prefer working with children more. For me, I think the biggest passion of mine is just being able to provide all the possible resources to a family that might be unaware of what they should have. I think when we talk about health education, not just in hearing, but also outside of hearing, is a lot of times families are unaware of what they have access to or what they should be having access to. And I think that is something I really feel strongly about, is making sure that we are the best advocates for the families and we are the best advocates for the patient. So I feel that I had that experience for my own audiologist. Why can't I just relay that same experience to patients and future patients?
When you're working with kids, do they have any concept that you have a hearing loss? Do they identify with you as such, as a role model, or are they completely oblivious to the situation?
I will say one of the biggest issues I've come across is that I'm no longer cool. Okay, so I thought I was young and cool, but I'm not anymore. To these kids, I am not. They look at me like, okay, and you have a hearing loss, great. It's really so sad that I'm coming to terms with this. That being said, I do think that there are little moments here and there where I definitely can relate. And for some kids, that's really eye-opening. For others, okay, whatever. But like even just little things of, bullying in school, or just like the device being so big on their head, or just even teachers doubting them. Those little small passive aggressive moments that I think some parents or friends may overlook, but can be really harmful to kids' confidence and advocacy. Even those moments, if I can connect with them on that, or even just sitting there and listening to them complain, is just an extra set of ears, no pun intended, but like just to be able to listen to them, I think goes a long way, because I do understand when the hearing aid sounds slightly off, but you can't prove it in any kind of, verification or validation or anything. Like when you send it in and the company's like, it's fine, but it just sounds slightly off. Like, I get that. I understand that. So just, giving them that validation for some kids go a long way. For others, like I said, I'm not cool anymore.
I'm not sure I ever was cool, so I don't know.
It's
what that's
so
like.
sad. It's like, oh God, I didn't realize that. Yeah.
I'm just gonna pretend to be oblivious and say I was always cool.
Ah,
That's probably the way I gotta go. I think I gotta take lessons from you, because it hurts each time. I'm like, oh.
fair enough. So, Dr. Hammerslaw, how did you get to be an ENT?
Well, it's a long story, but I knew I wanted to be an otologist when I was exposed to some ear surgery. One of the doctors in town, when I was actually in high school, took me to the OR, and he demonstrated some stapes surgery, and I thought that was cool. And having a hearing loss, I gravitated towards that, and that's, I think, how I got involved with it, and I sort of focused my medical school training to position myself to try to be at the top of my class in otolaryngology so I can get a good residency. But the personal motivation was always, there was a personal connection and motivation based on my hearing loss.
That makes perfect sense. Were you, how easily accepted were you with your hearing loss? Was this a challenge socially, or not socially, but as part of the education from your peers? Or were you immediately respected for having unique insights, or what was the process like?
From childhood, or as a professional?
Becoming a professional.
Oh, once I got into medical school, I was, there was no distinction made. Most of my faculty were totally oblivious to it. Through what was then the New York League for the Hard of Hearing, actually, they got me into a program where I was being rehabilitated by the state of New York, which paid for my medical school tuition, $3,000 a year. And I paid that back in taxes, I can assure you. But and then they arranged for a note taker. And basically one of my fellow students would slip his notes to some office, and they would Xerox them or copy them and give them to me. So that was the only accommodation. I used I had some, I used hearing aids then, and my hearing was better than it turned out to be later. Then it turned out to be later, and I used an amplified stethoscope with some degree of success. Actually, they let me get by in cardiology. I remember going down to Hopkins to meet with, not Blaylock, I can't remember her name. She was a colleague at Blaylock who invented the open heart surgery for flu baby operation. And she had a hearing loss. And she said, "Oh, cardiology is easy. You just put your hand on the chest and you can feel everything." And I tried, and it didn't work for me. I twisted my hand every which way. But anyway, they let me get by on the cardiology part in terms of auscultation and listening to them.
How difficult was it? How difficult was it for you to get a note taker and accommodations?
I'm sorry. It was not difficult. I was in a medical school that we prided ourselves on as being somewhat liberal, and it was not hard for them to put out a little bulletin to the class who wants to make some extra money, letting their notes be copied. That's about all they did. I mean, there was nothing after that. There wasn't any FM units or amplification or any special support in the operating room. The operating room, I was able to get away with it because we were around a small operative site. Even though we had masks on, I could hear because we were close to each other. I wasn't able to hear from the other end of the operating room in terms of an operating room nurse or an anesthesiologist speaking. And I would have to ask whoever was next to me what was said, and they would repeat it. So in that process, it was not a problem. I did have a problem with lectures, and I did need the note taker. I struggled, and somewhat was oblivious to it. Somehow I did my reading ahead of time, but I realized, when it came to the punchline, or that flat sentence that gives you the conclusion, somehow my ears wouldn't take me through. So I had to compensate other ways in terms of reading material ahead of time and using the note taker. In terms of strategies in my profession, in addition to the amplified stethoscope, I had to take on call in the various hospitals. So AT&T had this light activation unit that would turn on a bed light when the phone rang. So that would wake me up. And it was fine. It was somewhat problematic with some of my fellow residents because sometimes I forgot to turn it off and the phone would ring and they would find themselves out of bed. That's like, we used beepers, so I didn't have to, we didn't struggle. I used telecoil. I was able to use a telecoil for the telephone, so that was no problem in terms of communication. And in my residency, the support I had was minimal in my pediatric internship and in my general surgery. But they all said, well, he's going into ENT, and they sort of gave me a little bit of Hail Mary, a pass. But when I got to ENT, my chief at Mass Eye at Harvard was extremely supportive of me. I think back about it emotionally that I didn't quite have anybody that encompassing in terms of their support. He didn't take extra time, but somehow he made me feel that I compensated more because I couldn't hear. I had better visual, spatial capability, or my dexterity was better than seeing in other people. So, and he sort of felt I processed information differently, and he was fine with it. He thought it provided additional insight, and so I was in an environment that was very nurturing, and it's something I try to do with other residents later on. Mm-hmm.
Sounds like you're very lucky for your environment.
Yeah.
John, you got your hands up? You want to get a question?
Yes, I do. Like many of us in this group, I have had many hearing tests, particularly since I got my implant. I go every few months to check my progress. And I sit in the booth and the audiologist is on the other side of the window. And I hear recordings of words and sentences, and then I'm supposed to repeat them. I just occasionally wonder if that audiologist on the other side of the window had a hearing loss. How would they be able to score my responses, particularly with the isolated words? Sentences are easy, they're easier for me certainly, but also probably easier for the audiologist. But when there are just isolated, like 3-letter words, how do they hear them to determine whether I'm answering correctly?
That's a very valid concern. And I could tell you that every audiologist with hearing loss who goes through the training also has that same concern, because we want to be able to score the words correctly. And I could speak for myself, but I think many of my colleagues might do the same thing. But I use a remote microphone technology so that I would have the patient wear a microphone on his or her shirt, and then it will wirelessly take their voice and stream it directly into my hearing aids, so I can hear their words more clearly than otherwise expected.
But you can also see through the window and see the patient. You could lip read.
If you can lip read. But the other thing is that the modern technology, the modern audiometers, they automatically score correct and incorrect. And clinically, I had patients write down their responses when I had an audiologist I was supervising who had a hearing loss. So there are ways around it.
Before the mask, I did rely heavily on lip reading. And I realized by the end of the day, I was pretty exhausted, as many of us here can attest to, listening fatigue and putting that extra work in. I more recently have done the same thing where I've adapted having a partner, a mic that is on the patient side, especially with little kids that have very squeaky voices. I rely heavily on that technology. But I think that this is definitely a question that we all have addressed, as Viral has said, and it's something that we've all learned to, hone in on skill-wise, and focus on making sure that we are giving the correct scores for our patients.
The other thing that I've experimented around with, and I decided not to use it, but I've also experimented with using speech to text technology, whereby the microphone will be connected to my cell phone, for example, and then the cell phone can transcribe the words. It hasn't personally, at least in my own personal case, worked out that well for me, partly because of the delay, and partly because I felt pretty confident in what I heard in general. So I haven't really adopted that into my clinical practice, but I also think that it's an option that is well worth exploring for many of us audiologists who have hearing loss.
A lot of times I just also confirm what the patient is saying. That's okay to just ask them to repeat that word, to make sure that's the word that I think that they're saying.
Ruth, got a question for us?
Yes, I do. Please describe the nature of your hearing loss. Is it profound, whatever? And what devices are you using? Are you wearing hearing aids, CIs? Please let us know. One of you start, Dr. Hammerschlag.
Okay. Right now, there's a profound hearing loss. I had a pretty severe hearing loss as a child. And I had a hearing aid. I was fitted when I was about 4 years old. My parents didn't, the diagnosis came late, and it's a autosomal dominant diagnosis, namely its family is inherited by, through the family. There's a genetic basis to it. And I use a Zenith hearing aid in the box. I use a radio ear hearing aid in the box with the ear mold in the ear. Then I switched to, I think, Sony built into my glasses when I was about 13, 14 years old. And then I had a bunch of, other hearing aids over time behind the ear. And then in 1920, and then my hearing really started to deteriorate more. And in 2014, I got my first cochlear implant, which I probably should have gotten 10 years earlier, but I was waiting for it to be more perfect, even though I was implanting patients with it. I was still waiting for myself, but finally I couldn't improvise enough, you know, and so I got that, and in 2019 I got the second implant, which is both of which are nucleus.
Thank you. Sophie?
I have a severe to profound sentinel hearing loss in both ears. I wear hearing aids. I've always worn behind the ear hearing aids. I specifically wear resound. I went from phonak to darky, now resound. Most likely will not try the other companies. I think I gotta stick to just one for the moment. And the etiology of my hearing loss is unknown. Was diagnosed at 2.5 and got hearing aids at 3, and we don't know the cause of it. And I'm okay with that.
Thank you, Sophie. Viral?
So I've had hearing loss in both ears from birth, and I was born in India in the late 80s and then came to the US when I was 3 years old. So I was identified at around age 3, which was very common because back then, because the whole concept of newborn hearing screening wasn't there until the early 90s, mid to early 90s. So I've worn hearing aids in both ears since I was 3 years old. I currently have, and it's been stable, knock on wood, but I have a moderate to severe hearing loss in one ear and a moderately severe to profound hearing loss in the other ear. So my left ear is my good ear, and I rely on that quite a bit for my daily functioning. So as far as the etiology of my hearing loss, I had the fortunate ability to be able to get some genetic testing while I was at University of Iowa, because at Iowa we have a huge genetic research program over there. So I got enrolled into one of the studies to get blood work done to see if there was any genetic component of my hearing loss. And it was actually really interesting because I found out that I have a mutation that affects approximately 0.02% of Asians. So I hit the hearing loss lottery in a not so good way, but there you have it.
Viral, do you wear hearing aids?
I wear two hearing aids.
All right, we have Terrence who has joined us. Terrence, are you there? I saw you. All right, David, who am I missing?
Terrence, I think. Is he here? I'm not seeing him.
I think Terrence signed on and then something technical went wrong because he
Oh.
was here and then he's not here anymore.
Oh, he is on the list of people connected, but not audio connected. Okay.
Well,
Hopefully he'll
Terrence
show up in
is
a
our
moment.
tech specialist, so if he can't get on, then there's something going on.
So Viral,
So-
I would love to ask you about the other hat that you have. You're very active in the research community, and I am vaguely aware that you're involved in a research community of hearing impaired researchers who research hearing. Can you tell us something about this community and what it's like?
Sure. This is a community of scientists as well as clinical professionals with hearing loss. So it includes basic hearing scientists. It includes audiologists, especially those who are involved with research. It includes ENTs. So it's a wide gamut of professionals who are somewhat connected to the auditory sciences and have hearing loss themselves. I became a member several years ago, I think about, wow, maybe 10 years ago now at this point. And I was recruited by a professor at Johns Hopkins University who started this group back in the 90s with one of his colleagues. And it was very funny how I got recruited because I was at a research conference in Baltimore back when I was back when I was in grad school, and he just happened to see my hearing aids and just flagged me down. Like he just ran after me and just like flagged me down and said, "Hey, I want to tell you about this group." But it's been a wonderful group because it provides a good social support system and mentorship opportunities for especially for students who are trying to make their way through the field. And as with HLAA and any other support groups, AG Bell, NAD, we all know how important it is to have that support system and have that safe space to just vent your frustrations, but also just to get some advice and get some mentorship and make some connections with other professionals. And now that I've been in the field for a couple of more years, I've been on the other side where I've also mentored a few students here and there, and I think it's very important, this whole concept of a support system as well as mentorship. So this group means a lot to me for sure.
Mary, you have a question?
Yes, I guess I'm just curious. Do each of you disclose to a new patient that you have a hearing loss? And have you lost any patients because you have a hearing loss?
Well, I think all my patients know that I have a hearing loss. And it's on my website, and I think a lot of people think I might have a little bit more insight to their problem because of the hearing loss. So I don't think I've lost any patients. I do remember earlier in my career, somebody came in and had said, "Well, you have a sensory neural hearing loss, and this could be best managed with amplification." And right now, there doesn't seem to be any medicine available or surgery available that would reverse the process or take care of it. And he said, I can't even, I have the same problem and I can't get a better solution. And I think somehow I got the feeling that they were disappointed, and for some reason, they had to go to a hearing person to find out if there would be a better solution. Or maybe I didn't hear about the right solution. But that's the only time that I really am aware of it. So, and I think the majority of the patients were grateful that I did have a hearing loss, in the sense there was some empathy, and I was able to give them more advice about getting auditory rehabilitation and training, lip reading, whereas most of my colleagues would just say, you need a hearing aid and go to the audiologist. But I would also insist that they would get some rehab, even if the audiologist didn't, if there was an audiologist outside of my office or in their local community who wasn't really familiar with the rehab resources or really push for it. So that was a little bit of a difference on my part.
Larry, do you have a question for us?
I don't have a question, but I have sensorineural hearing loss and I'm a cochlear implant user. I'm bilaterally implanted, but I just use the one. But I will say, being a patient since I was 3 years old, I've only ever once had one audiologist who did my mapping who had hearing loss and was a cochlear implant user. And I was so grateful because he got it. He was able to understand, you know, what I was able to explain to him, because as someone who's only been deaf, I never have been able to hear naturally. It's so hard sometimes to explain to the hearing audiologist what it sounds like, because they understand the science and they understand the technology, but they just don't get it the way that hearing or like people with hearing loss do. So I will say, like, if I never would have walked away from a doctor who has hearing loss, like I would have actually been more inclined to go and see them, just because they get it and they get that, like what we're going through.
Yeah, I just want to go off of that because I think it's really crucial for me. One of the things I don't always disclose to my patients that I have a hearing loss. I kind of, if it comes up, it comes up, because some patients, some families, you know, I have to sort of prioritize the focus on what they need and what they need to get out of it, the appointment. And I think one of the things that I have come across when it comes to cochlear implant mapping is that I actually don't know what it's like, because I hear differently in the sense that I hear acoustically because I wear hearing aids. I don't hear electrically with cochlear implant. However, I understand everything else that comes with it, right? And I think that that experience, I think, is so crucial when it comes to programming hearing aids or mapping. There's some things that are just, you can't explain always. You can sort of express it in every way you can, but a hearing person probably will never understand what you're trying to express or what little tweaking you need done. So I agree. I've never had that opportunity to have an audiologist that has a hearing loss, but it's always something that I wish that I had.
So I have a similar philosophy as well, in the sense that I don't disclose outright that I have hearing loss to my patients. It's not that I don't want to talk about it. You know, I believe the focus has to be on them, and then and addressing their needs. And then if my hearing loss comes up, so be it. I'm happy to talk about it. And then, you know, I primarily see cochlear implant patients. That's my specialty. And, you know, I think, you know, obviously I cannot understand what it's like to hear electrically at all. But I think for the cochlear implant patients, I'm willing to talk about it a little bit more than a normal, you know, a patient coming in for a normal hearing test. Because, you know, I think it helps them realize that I get it to some extent. You know, I don't get it to the extent that hearing electrically is very different from hearing from hearing aids, but I get it to some extent. So, you know, for those specialized cochlear implant patients, I think it's a little bit more important to talk about it if you can. But then, you know, on the occasion where I, you know, sometimes have to see a patient for a normal hearing test, I don't bring it up because it's not completely relevant, maybe, or, you know, it just don't have the time to pick it up.
I actually think this is a very interesting topic. I would be curious to know how the audience in general feels about going to seeing a clinician with a hearing impairment. I've just created a quick poll. Can I ask you to respond very quickly? And I would like to get a sense of what you guys think, because unfortunately I don't have time to ask everyone individually. Okay, this is up, hopefully. It's coming through okay. really have no idea what to expect for answers on this. Okay. Are we good? Shall I stop? All right, I'm going to halt it. Okay. For those of you who are interested in seeing the results, can you see them? Is it work? Is it coming through?
Yes, it's
Yeah.
coming through.
Yeah,
Interesting. I really had no idea what to expect for this one. Okay. Fair enough. Okay. John, you have a question?
Yeah, just a quick. First of all, I raised an obstacle before, something that might be more difficult for an audiologist with a hearing loss. But it does seem clear to me from what some of you were saying, and that you also have a kind of a superpower that of empathy and understanding that someone without a hearing loss doesn't have. I'm curious to ask Beryl, in terms of research, do you think that your hearing loss gives you ideas about research questions that someone with hearing might not have?
To some extent it has, and to some extent it hasn't. Because my research is focused mostly on cochlear implants. So even though I have hearing loss, I don't have cochlear implants. So, I can't say that my direct experiences with hearing loss directly impacted cochlear implant research per se. But I could tell you that, some of my cochlear implant research has also involved patients who were a cochlear implant in one ear and a hearing aid in either that same ear or the opposite ear. And just thinking about some of the challenges associated with combining electrical hearing and acoustic hearing, I think I think I can relate to that challenges to some extent. So, so in some ways it could inform some of my research ideas, but it's 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 a mix, to be honest. To some extent, like sometimes it does impact us, sometimes it doesn't, and it also depends on what specifically I'm focused on within the CI volume, because just because you're a cochlear implant researcher does not mean you do one thing. There's a whole gamut of things you can look into. So like David and I both do cochlear implant work, but we might explore totally different things.
I see Terrence is here.
Who needs to be unmuted? Who needs to be muted? There's noise.
Seems like whoever was maybe self-muted. So Terrence, welcome. Would you like to tell us something about how you ended up in audiology?
Sure. First, I want to apologize. I've been kind of under the weather and I was at a doctor's appointment that ran over. So apologies for getting in so late. These are some really interesting questions. How did I get into audiology? I actually started at the center when I was in high school. Just by coincidence, my mom had a friend who worked there. And when I went off to college, they said to me, you'll be back. And I said, well, whatever. Hey, that's what you say. And as soon as I got home and I was struggling to be an actor, my mom suggested that I call the center, and then at that time, the League for the Hard of Hearing, and see if they could give me some work while I was honing my craft. And I've been there ever since. My hearing loss was actually diagnosed at a convention that I went to. that Starkey gave. If I'm remembering correctly, I failed a lot of hearing screenings when I was in elementary school, but I have a moderate high frequency hearing loss, so I was very easily able to pass through school. I mean, it was a struggle getting through school and stuff, but eventually I got through. And when I went to this convention for Starkey, they yelled at me for struggling. And why was I struggling at a hearing aid convention? And they did a hearing test for me and fit with me with my first set of hearing aids while I was in Minnesota. And this was, I'll just say I was 22 at the time. I won't say how long ago it was. And for me, I mostly struggle in situations where there's lots of talking going on. I have a hard time in noisy places. And it hasn't been till recently that my hearing aids have caught up with my hearing loss so that I'm able to successfully use the hearing aids. And, you know, at work, it really depends on who I'm with, whether or not I share my hearing loss with persons. Although I will say, generally, when I start to listen to folks' hearing aids and have to take my own out, it kind of puts the subject into the forefront of the conversation because people want to know what I'm wearing and why I'm wearing them and all those kinds of good things. And I tried not to influence anybody with what I'm wearing because we all know that hearing loss is so individual and people hear so differently that technology from person to person is something that's really subjective, and I really feel like it's best if we stick to what works for the patient rather than what works for me. So I do a lot of digging into what the client needs rather than what I'm using currently. I don't know if that answered your question, David, but
Yeah, I have to ask, what were you doing? Was this coincidence? What were you doing at a conference with the hearing loss, undiagnosed, but struggling, but getting your ears tested? This sounds like too much of a coincidence.
well, I had just started working in the dispensary at the Center for Hearing and Communications, and then known as League for the Hard of Hearing. And I participated in a project, a research project for one of our audiologists. I helped them work on the project, and we went to the convention together. It was the first time I ever got to do anything like that. I was still a baby dispenser at that point, so I hadn't had much experience then, and working on that research project really was helpful. If I'm remembering correctly, it was we were comparing analog, ITEs, repair, studying how often the hearing aids going for repair, what the reasons were, and you know the best companies at fixing hearing aids and not needing repair, all that kind of good thing. And as I mentioned, I had been failing hearing screening every year in school, but the type and configuration of my hearing loss at the time, even when I was in school, was not one that was fit very often, just because my lows were so good. So very often when I was wearing my first set of hearing aids were a set of CICs that were most of the time in my pant pocket rather than in my ears. And it wasn't until the digital technology came out and the RIC came back into play, that I was really able to utilize hearing aids successfully and quit saying what so often.
Thank you. Arlene, you've got a question for us?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I love being here. I see so many familiar faces. What struck me was an experience I had just recently. I have cochlear implants now after 25 years of hearing aids, and now 25 years of cochlear implants. But as you know, you get your hearing tested to see how you're doing, have relatively new processors. Well, I just wanted to share this with you, and kind of it brought up because of if you had a clinician that also had hearing loss. When I go into that soundproof booth and they started testing me, I started to cry. And that's how traumatic that whole process is. So I never had a audiologist that had a hearing loss. I had great audiologists, you know, no complaints there. But I know that when, you know, I wrote books on my cochlear implant experience, and sometimes the topic was on, you're in that booth and it's the most traumatic thing you ever had. And I have to realize I lost my hearing when there were no cochlear implants at the end of that rainbow. So I was going to fall off. So that was the trauma. So just to put Terrence into this equation, when I was at the league with hearing aids and I had a problem with one hearing aid, and I gave it to Terrence to see if he could fix it. And oh my God, he worked his magic. And I said, this is really one smart cookie here. And so I just wanted you to know what we have in this room here. So that's my reminiscence that, you know, from one person with hearing loss to another. I don't remember what you did to that hearing aid, but I thought it was hopeless and you just fixed it. So bravo. I've been meaning to thank you for about 40 years. I've been meaning to thank you for about 40 years, so thank you.
No worries, glad to help.
I second that motion, Arlene. It's true.
Nancy, have you got a question for us?
I don't have a question, but David, your survey brought up something. I thought that you could have added another option.
Oh, I'm sure. It was quick, impromptu, and sloppy.
No, I thought it was wonderful that you thought of it on the fly and we were able to see what the results were. But had one of the choices been provided the doctor is a good one, would you prefer to go to one with hearing loss or one without hearing loss? And frankly, with my own experience, and I'm sure a lot of people will relate to this, I would opt for somebody with a hearing loss so that they would understand what I'm going through, especially when you're walking into a doctor's office for the past 2.5 years or a million years, it feels like, when everyone is wearing a mask and they're talking with their back to you. Or they're talking behind you, or they're talking with their head down, and how to remind them and keep reminding them and be exasperated and getting exhausted by it. I don't have, that's one side of it, and that's my own experience, and I'm sure all of you have suffered with going into an office or anywhere and having to talk to somebody with a mask on. But what I do want to say to our panelists is that I find that all of you are so brave. You went into a field knowing that it could be an uphill battle, a big challenge. Of all the fields of medicine that you could have gone into, you rose above that challenge with your hearing losses, and your level of empathy and compassion comes through so much. And I'm very grateful to witness this. So thank you so much for your time and efforts of being here and sharing with us your experience.
Yes.
Dino, have you got a question?
Yes, it's really more of a comment, but I think it's relevant to some of this discussion. I'm in my late 80s and was diagnosed quite late in my 70s. And my generation, to some extent, missed the digital revolution. And to me, one of the greatest challenges is simply the technology, the CapTels and the captioning and the different systems, loop systems. And I've been trying to find the right person that could perhaps be a personal consultant to me on this. Someone mentioned every one of us has different types of problems. And I think that is the truth. I attended the walk Sunday, and more important, I attended the hour-and-a-half rally that took place before the walk. It was very, very good, sponsored by providers and activists in the field. And the name of Terrence came up several times in response to my inquiries. I had two inquiries. How do I find a really savvy technologist? And second, strangely enough, teachers of American Sign Language are not out there readily available, at least to my internet searches. And I did get some good references from the woman who was the master or mistress of ceremonies. So I live in New York. I'm retired. I live in New York and Tucson. And I joined recently this organization to just get more information. And so far, it is really paying off very well. And I appreciate the work that you do, and I intend to become and remain more active in the group.
Rita, have you got a question for us?
I'm wondering if in this forum it's appropriate to ask about tinnitus, which seems there seems to be woefully little research on that condition, despite the fact that so many people have it. I'm wondering if there's insight among the professionals here.
My wife has studied tinnitus extensively, and she has just left to go get tacos.
I'd call that imperfect timing.
And I have very little to say myself. I'm sorry.
So David, I'll chime in here. There's a lot of research on tinnitus, and it still remains an enigma to most researchers. There are a multitude of solutions, and tinnitus is a symptom. And most people, tinnitus is a symptom such that it's a symptom of hearing loss and other conditions. And one of probably the most successful treatments, although there's individual variability in terms of who's going to benefit, is a hearing aid. So even if somebody doesn't have a significant hearing loss, they might have a slight hearing loss. There are people who do benefit from hearing aid technology for their tinnitus, but there's a lot of variability. There's a lot we don't know, and you have to experiment, and because we still do not know all the solutions, but we do know that for some people, hearing aids are quite effective in terms of managing tinnitus.
Can I add something to what Barbara said? Last year or the year before, the Hearing Health Foundation had a webinar on tinnitus, and it was really excellent. If you go to their website, you can go back, they record them the way we do, and hear what the presentation was there. We've been thinking about having a presentation on tinnitus as a chapter topic, and I think we will at some point. Thank you, Barbara.
Can I just add something, David? I just wanted to add, as a normal hearing audiologist.
Yep.
I'm going to advocate for the fact that persons with hearing loss who are audiologists bring something different to the table than I do. But as a researcher who's focused my life on the psychosocial effects of hearing loss on people with hearing loss, the effects of masks on hearing loss, those of us who do research and really understand the impacts of hearing loss Empathy is a really, really important characteristic of good audiologists. So you don't have to have a hearing loss to be a really good audiologist, but it helps. But empathy is a really, really important feature of a really good audiologist. Not so sure how you can assess that when you're going to see the audiologist, but perhaps Sophie might be able to add to that. I'm going to put Sophie on the spot.
I could tell you sometimes one of the ways I show empathy is I just say, well, honestly, it sucks. Like that's probably not the most, appropriate way to say things to patients in clinics, but the fact that I'm willing to say something like, you know what, yeah, it sucks, actually makes me feel a little bit better because I'm not missing words, so to speak. I just being direct, but I still say it in empathetic, in an empathetic fashion. Like I'm not trying to sugarcoat it, if that makes any sense.
I do agree with you, Will, that there's some cases where it can be quite blunt and honest. However, because I spent a lot of time working diagnosing babies, I think that conversation with parents dealing with their child having recently been diagnosed with hearing loss is a really tough one. And sometimes it is helpful to have it come from a professional with a hearing loss because it provides a different insight that, a different map, sort of a roadmap or a vision that they have for their baby, that anything is really possible. And I'm sure for most of us here, an example of a professional is always helpful for parents, especially when they're getting, in their eye, devastating news, because this is not what they envisioned for their child. And then all of a sudden, things are totally different. And now they have to learn about hearing aids and now possibly cochlear implants and what's the right decision and what's the right education. And they're just such an overwhelming experience that if we can provide that safe space and that validation that we are here to give them all the support, and that yes, it can suck, and yes, there are going to be obstacles, and yes, it's going to be an uphill battle, but that love that you have for your child doesn't change whether they have the hearing loss or not. So I think that just being that voice of reason from a professional with a hearing loss does help with new diagnosed babies and their families.
Catherine, you've had your hand up for a very long time now. You got a question?
I do have a question. And so I'm wondering, in your medical settings as a whole, outside the ENT departments, do your colleagues know that you have hearing loss? And especially during the pandemic, when so many people realized that they actually couldn't hear very well when they had a mask on, I'm wondering if your hearing loss has turned out to be something that they come to consult you about. It may be, this is probably not true for Terrence because you're studying as all people with hearing loss, but the rest of you work in medical centers with a lot of hearing professionals. Is this an issue that ever comes up? I guess not.
I will say it does come up in a sense that I have constantly have to ask doctors and to repeat themselves. And I'm not afraid to do that, but it is super frustrating. When it's an ENT doctor that's speaking very quietly. It's, what field are we in? Yeah. But I also have found I'm not used to being in the operating room, as our other panelists might be here. But it's definitely a struggle that I've sort of had to come to terms with, where there's a lot of equipment. And so I learned very quickly to advocate for myself and say, I will speak loudly myself, and I'll tell people that I'm going to be speaking loudly, kind of take it or leave it. but I have had to ask many people to speak up because I don't think they realize how muffled the mask is or how quietly they're speaking. A lot of times I ask you to rephrase it as opposed to repeating. Just rephrase what you said, because I find rephrasing way better than repeating loudly.
I could tell you that when I've gone to the OR during cochlear implant surgeries, I'll go to the OR, and if they have music playing and if it's loud, I don't even ask if I can turn it down. I just go ahead and turn it down so that we all can communicate. But that being said, yeah, it's even for us with hearing loss. I mean, all my colleagues who I work with, thankfully know how to speak appropriately. But I could tell you that, working with other medical professionals, it's more frustrating because they don't really realize how to communicate with people with hearing loss. And then, as all of you have experienced, I've also experienced the same thing where in the last couple of years, due to the pandemic, me interacting with other healthcare professionals as a patient has been, I just want to I don't know, punch a wall or something, because speaking through somebody who's wearing an N95 mask, which I understand, but the N95 mask is a killer. Speaking behind those plexiglass barriers is a killer. Having both at the same time is even more of a killer. And I'm just like, oh my God, let's just be done with this. But it's yeah, I mean, there's no easy way around it, but at least within my own field and my own profession, I can control things a little bit better, even without asking. I just do it.
I just want to add to two things with regards to some of the comments earlier. One was about going to a doctor with a hearing loss and going to a doctor whose back is facing you. I set up my office not to help my patient, but me, in terms of the electronic records in the computer. It was on a rather expensive articulating arm that would bring the computer in front so I could look at the patient, which meant that the patient could see me too. As opposed to I had to type in front of the patient. So there was an advantage for the patient with the hearing loss. And then meetings, more recently, the professional societies are gearing up with assistive technology, whether it be CARD or FM or the loop or something like that. And that's really a consequence of the issue of diversity. And hearing loss or disability is part of diversity. And towards the end of my career, I started to get the professional societies to actually create the environment for those of us who needed some type of supplementary auditory help to follow the lectures or hear things. So even our field has been been somewhat slow on the uptake. I think now they're becoming more aware of it. And in terms of the mask, it sucks. Even if you have somebody with a clear mask, some people still have problems. And the hospitals do have access to clear masks for people with hearing loss, if you need to do that. But that may depend on your institution. But you can try to ask for it.
I find a lot too that sometimes medical professionals don't necessarily want to share their own personal medical history with their coworkers. And I do find a lot, we have folks that will come to us who ask to help them hear in those environments. And we do our very best and that we can to help them hear when there's lots of people speaking and when they're aided or not aided or for auscultation, all that sort of thing. I know at the center we work really hard to try to make communication as accessible as possible, but that's sort of what we do. So I don't know if it's fair to compare that to other medical facilities, but I know that it can be challenging, totally challenging. I mean, today I was just at the doctor and then at the pharmacy today, and everyone had on a mask. Everyone was through their plexiglass screens, and I'm fumbling with my phone to turn on my remote microphone so that I can sort of sneak it underneath the plexiglass so that I can hear what the person is saying. And it's just challenging. And I think most of it is just that everybody are just people, and people tend not to be accommodating. It just is. And that's why I think everybody just keeps saying it sucks. People don't think beyond themselves very often. And I think we as hearing impaired people would like a little bit more of that thinking outside of your own needs and such. But I think the best way to deal with it is how everybody else has been saying, is they just, they don't even ask. People don't ask. We demand, and we make changes that work for us wherever we go someplace.
David, I think we have to wind this up.
Yeah, I was just noticing the time.
Yeah.
Barbara just raised her hand. I don't know whether you want to give her a quick question, or you want to call it.
Yeah, Barbara, go ahead and ask your question, and then we'll stop.
Okay.
You're muted, Barbara. You're muted.
Which Barbara's that? Because my hand's not up.
Okay, can you hear me now? Yeah, are you hearing me?
Yeah. Yes, Barbara? Oh, no.
You turned it off, turn it back on.
Barbara, we can't hear you. And actually, I think we need to end because
All right.
there's a lot of people said they wanted to go on to the Westchester meeting at 7:30. So
Okay.
Barbara, maybe we can send your question after the meeting is over. Anyway, I just want to say thank you to everybody who's came, and I want to thank the panelists so much. This was just really fascinating to hear this from your perspective. You brought up a lot of issues that I think all of us are very, very familiar with. And Terrence, I hope you feel better. Our next month chapter meeting, this is the third Tuesday of the month. We have a really great meeting. It's Nina Kraus, who is an expert on hearing in the brain, and she has a lab called Sound Volts, and she's written a book on that topic. And so I hope you come back next Thursday. I mean, not next Thursday, next month. And we will again try to start the meeting right at 6 or 1 or 2 minutes after to give us enough time to get through everything. And Barbara, I'm sorry we didn't get to you. And your name underneath is Ruth Bernstein for some reason. So on that, I think we'll end. Thank you so much, David, for being a really terrific moderator. Okay, bye.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Oh, and thank you, Lauren. You did a terrific job. Thank you.
Always thank you, Lauren.
Yeah.
Good night.
Have a good one.
Bye-bye. Thank you, panelists.